So, last time I saw you, you were trying to kill everybody. Where are you at these days?
It varies from moment to moment.
So I've been watching the new Loki series on Disney Plus, and I have to say I am thoroughly enjoying it. The character is so well understood by Tom Hiddleston, and I'm really loving the sort of spin perspective on the variant Sylvie. But as fun and cunning and witty as Marvel's Loki is, it is just that. Marvel's Loki, a commercial property of a media conglomerate. But does that mean that the original Loki of Norse myth in the Eddas is real, and Marvel's Loki, the branded one, is not? The answer might be more nuanced than you were expecting. So today, let's not just look at Loki, but the popularization of myth and how modern interpretations of ancient beings can then affect the characteristics and identities of those beings and those gods. If you've been around here before, hey, how you doing? If you are new, thanks for stopping by. Feel free to leave a comment below, subscribe, say hi. Part 1, Stories and Pop Culture. So I live in Seattle, which has the Mopop, or Museum of Pop Culture. It's a good time in there with exhibitions from like Harry Potter costumes and set props and vintage Marvel comics and a Jimi Hendrix gallery. Every time I go in there, I am just in awe of how curators are able to get the meaning of pop culture across without words, but just with what they've curated in the museum. I think that careful exhibition in combination with engagement with the public just works some magic. Inside are artifacts that are not just famous, but they are whole personalities, franchises, and brands that bring different generations together. Like Nirvana was a mere moment in music history, but impactful enough that scholars or just like rock music enthusiasts or people in your lunch group all have an opinion, and all of that is packed in there. Grandpas are just as excited to get a picture with Spider-Man as their 4-year-old grandchildren are. So pop culture literally means the cultural activities or commercial products reflecting, suited to, or aimed at the tastes of the general masses of people. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that you're immune from pop culture because you like Wes Anderson and British underground hip-hop music. I'm speaking to myself here, by the way. But you're not. Everyone, and I mean everyone, is influenced by pop culture. If you're a millennial like me, for instance, you might remember shopping at Hot Topic and thinking that that was alternative in some way or underground. And with the benefit of growing up in time, you realize it was not. It was and is pop culture. It's like in the name, Hot Topic. So what does myth and storytelling have to do with any of this? Well, like mythology, these products and activities that emerge from pop culture, they're often rooted in stories, and stories have a really cool way of uniting a cultural identity or a societal identity. Whether written or oral, stories are often used to maintain a cultural identity. And while pop culture isn't necessarily mythology, and mythology isn't necessarily religion, that doesn't mean that these things aren't entirely disconnected either. Joseph Campbell said that mythology may, in a real sense, be defined as other people's religion, and religion may, in a sense, be understood as a popular misunderstanding of mythology. One could argue that the ancient world had pop culture too, albeit very different. It didn't come in the form of mass media like we are used to today. Take the Odyssey, for example. This is an epic and iconic poem that was originally oral and eventually written down, but it features someone called Athena. She's a goddess, but a regular in the plot. The Odyssey is not about the Greek gods, but it does feature them as characters. For me, this begs the question, do we consider these representations of Athena in the Odyssey to be true representations of her as a sacred being, or is this more like fan fiction? Without talking to a focus group of ancient Greeks, we won't know the answer to that. Part 2. Enter the Trickster.
We're not just looking for a time criminal, we're looking for a Loki, a variation of this guy. A type we should all be very familiar with because the TVA has pruned a lot of these guys, almost more than any other variant.
So something brilliant that the Marvel series does with Loki is comment on his appearance as a character through the ages. He's in the Eddas, he's in Shakespeare, he's in the comics, he's in the MCU, and now he's all over the MCU's timeline. But where does Loki actually come from? Well, the thing is, Loki's not really unique. He is essentially an archetype. Loki is an archetype of the shapeshifter, the trickster, the mischief maker. And this trickster figure is fundamental to human storytelling. Like the archetype of the hero or the wise one or the great mother, the trickster archetype is a character, somebody who has a critical role to play in a narrative. There is always a spot for a character that you don't know if you can trust, somebody who might be just as deceitful as they are playful, cunning and witty, but also charming, possibly romantic. That combination of heroic and vengeful and deceptive all at once is what makes this archetype so intriguing. Tom Hiddleston understands this.
He is mischievous and playful and witty and charismatic and charming, but he's also broken and damaged and vulnerable. And the cocktail of those things, the wit and the charm and the vulnerability and the grievance, and you just shake it up and you have this character who can change shape. And he's the shapeshifter, the trickster, somebody who's transgressive and disruptive, who exists on this line between good and bad.
Marvel executes on these traits of Loki throughout the MCU, and they use it to their advantage in their storytelling. You know, when the trickster is on the side of the protagonist, they're an asset. When they're on the side of the antagonist, they're formidable. And when they're towing the line between, you're on the edge of your seat, waiting to see where they fall. Ancient storytellers also communicated the nature of this archetype through myths and plots, with characters like Anansi or Hanuman, and yes, Loki. But archetypes, according to Carl Jung, are not static. We need to keep in mind that, like human culture, archetypes are in a continuous and dramatic state of flux. They live, they split, and they unite again. It's like my new K-pop dance move. So yes, archetypes are powerful ideas, but what separates them from gods? Well, perhaps archetypes are a concept of beingness, a concept of a function or a natural law, at least as you and I as human beings innately understand it. But the gods are personalities that those archetypes take on, like a coat of paint that changes depending on the culture, the place, or the time. Jung said that archetypes resemble the beds of rivers, dried up because the water has deserted them, though it may return at any time. An archetype is something like an old watercourse along which the water of life flowed for a time, digging a deep channel for itself. The longer it flowed, the deeper the channel, and the more likely it is that sooner or later the water will return. With this metaphor, we can imagine the archetype of the trickster, for example, as a riverbed. It's dried up, but every 100 years or so it floods, and that flood is a Loki flood, bringing with it new life, new ideas. It's a predictable cycle, but a little different each time. And who's to say that the god Loki himself isn't influencing the nature of each of these incarnations? Part 3. Everything is chaos, and so are we.
Whatever it was, stepping off your path created a nexus event, which left unchecked could branch off into madness, leading to another multiversal war.
Now, I'm aware that it's a little simplistic for me to say that all stories and all myths and all pop culture that incorporates variations of a god are equally valid and equally true because they're all just variations on a theme. But I also think it would be equally simplistic to say that all of them are invalid because they're all just art. I don't think there is a clear line between what is real and not real, what is valid and invalid, when everything is subject to our consciousness, our experience, and our spiritual needs. Sometimes our spiritual needs and our desires for divinity will overlap with our desires for certain forms of art or media. So if you're a neo-pagan and you see the gods as archetypal personalities, how do you handle and negotiate these different interpretations of them that appear over the millennia? How does it affect your religious experience with them? But if you see the gods as very real beings, if you're a hard polytheist, what do you say to the idea that the gods themselves are not directly influencing the muses that then create these new interpretations? I guess what I'm asking is, what do you do with the chaos that is archetype and storytelling and belief? Tom Hiddleston talked about his portrayal of Loki as one in a long succession of many Lokis.
Loki is a character who's been around for thousands of years. He was in the, ancient Norse myths, turns up in opera and in theater and in literature, and then he turns up in the Marvel comics in the 60s, and Stan Lee makes him the antagonist in the Thor run.
This is much like how the show examines Loki within the Marvel universe. At the time of filming, I've only seen episodes 1 through 3, but so far, There's a lot of discussion on what it means to be a Loki. Sure, there are variations in powers and in appearance and gender, but we also learned in episode 3 that also there's differences in family history and dynamics. So what is a Loki? Well, I think what we can understand both from archetypes and mythology and from the series so far that Marvel is doing quite well is that Loki is as much an archetype as he is a personality. He is as individual as he isn't. He has a personality that is unique, but also interchangeable. That is chaotic, and an interesting meditation on the different portrayals that human beings create of their gods. Like Jung explained, an archetype constantly recurs in the course of history, and appears wherever creative fantasy is freely expressed. Essentially, it is a mythological figure. In each of these images, there is a little piece of human psychology and human fate, a remnant of the joys and sorrows that have been repeated countless times in our ancestral history. I think what Jung is saying here is that we are as much in witness of the gods as we are participants in the creation of them. We witness them through our consciousness, but we also actively shape the interpretation of what we witness. It's not a one-way relationship. Our input matters. When watching Tom Hiddleston interviews in preparation for this video, I came across a tidbit of information that actually demonstrates this perfectly. So it turns out that at the end of Thor: The Dark World, Loki was really supposed to die. Tom and Chris played that scene as a swan song.
Played it, for real. I thought, okay, that's it. That's the end of Loki. And then it goes 6 months actually, and then I got a call from Kevin Feige saying, Loki was, supposed to die. Well, we have tested the film, and the first thing people said was, well, where's Loki? And we said, well, you saw what happened. He makes the sacrifice play, and the audience says, well, obviously we don't believe that. And then that's how they came up with the new ending. It became a really fun new way to end the film and begin the next one.
And because of that change, we have Loki's playfulness in Ragnarok and how that starts. We have Loki's sacrifice in Infinity War. It was because of the audience participation in the telling of a story that Loki, as we understand him today as a character, changed and had moments where his character really came through, where he was able to be a hero or be deceptive. In other words, in the contemporary era, how Loki is portrayed, we as an audience are directly influencing that. And who's to say that that won't continue or didn't happen in the ancient world?
Across the stories of Loki from thousands of years ago, the most interesting aspect for me is that he was someone the other gods, Odin, Thor, Frigga, they had to sort of put up with and endure. He was unstable and treacherous, and you couldn't quite trust him. And then occasionally necessary. And when everybody else had run out of ideas, it was Loki's idea, but might be the thing that we need and might be the thing that saves us in the end. And I've always been drawn to this idea that Loki's chaos is occasionally something we need. As this unpredictable spirit, there's somebody who crosses boundaries and questions everything and changes shape. That's what I've loved about Loki, that you're never quite sure what his motivations are. And that I hope, audiences can see that there is good in him. There always was, and there are also these other instincts that are drawn towards something less virtuous. But there, he himself is a cocktail of all these ingredients.
So in conclusion, can you worship a Loki?
Savior is here!
Well, yes, probably, if you want to. The most popular religion in the United States is Christianity, which essentially is a religion built on worshiping the savior archetype. Jesus is the personality, and his interpretation has changed a lot since ancient Rome to today's rock band churches. So whether you're a hard polytheist or you're just interested in archetypes, I think it's worth examining where you draw the line on what representations of a deity are true and which ones are invalid. Of course, this is going to be what's true for you and why. All of us are going to be different. Like in the case of Athena and the Odyssey, do you consider that to be a sacred representation of her acting for real? Or is that more like fan fiction? I think it's really valid for pagans to want to emphasize reconstructivist approaches to their spiritual path by completely ignoring and not using modern sources of information or representation of their gods, choosing ancient ones exclusively. In that case, Marvel's Loki is just art. It's just for play. But I would also argue that it's impossible for us to escape the influence of popular culture. By its very nature, popular culture aims to influence our perceptions, our shared interests, and how we imagine things. I'd be lying if I said I don't picture Chris Hemsworth's face when I read about Thor, like the real Thor from the Edda. Examine yourself and examine how you may or may not have been influenced by popular culture and your perceptions of the gods, of myth, of magic, and maybe even of the ancient world itself. So in the end, can you worship Marvel's Loki? If it works for you, you're good to go. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate you stopping by. I am back on the floor. I was on the floor for a while and I got off the floor and I'm on the floor again. We are in the middle of rearranging our house for, I hope, the final time. When you live in 500 square feet, most of your weekends are rearranging furniture. So like I said, if you're new here, please feel free to leave a comment below, say hello. Also, if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please do so. That really helps me out. I'd love to hear more about how pop culture has influenced your pagan path. If you have just leaned into the chaos, brought it in, I would love to hear about that. If you decided to reject it all and go like hard ancient sources, I want to hear about that too. I feel like I'm a reconstructionist, but it's like a soft version. I don't know. Maybe I just pick and choose too much. Maybe I'm an inconsistent Pisces. I don't know. I'm happy. Anyway, I hope you're doing well, enjoying the start of summer, and I will see you next week. Toodles!